again, certainly grateful for the presence of everyone here this evening, and hope you'll follow along with me over the next few moments as we continue our series of studies that we've been in this will be our fifth lesson, dating back to the second Sunday of last month, in our series on biblical hermeneutics. In the passage that Jim just read for us in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 15, the Apostle Paul said, "To be diligent to present yourself approved unto God, a worker who has no need of being ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." And that is our goal in each and every study that we undertake. But this principles of hermeneutics is helping us get a better idea of how it is that we go about doing that. And so we began in our first lesson with a simple introduction to hermeneutics and to Bible study. And so we talked about what hermeneutics is. And then we talked about inductive Bible study and how and where we learn in the basics of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is that science of interpretation. And so that's what we're using, is figuring out how to interpret the text. Inductive Bible study, that's when we take and look at a text and we let the text induce our understanding. We're not drawing conclusions and then trying to find them in the text, nor are we just trying to spot something in the text that stands out, but we're looking at the text and trying to let what it says induce our understanding. We're looking at what it meant to those that it was originally written to. We talked about how and where we learn. We can learn in studies like this. There are a number of books written on biblical hermeneutics. But we can also learn by just observing a true textual study. And a truly textual study, and what I mean by truly textual, one that is inductive in nature, where we take the text and we move through the text and let it induce our understanding. A truly textual study will exemplify for us the principles of hermeneutics. And then we talked about some of those basic principles of hermeneutics there at the end, about reading and rereading and the context and background and all of that. Then really what we've been doing is taking some of those things and taking a closer look at them in the lessons that have followed. And so our second lesson was over background and context. And we talked about why it is that background is important. There are a number of epistles we can come to in the New Testament, and as we're reading them, they may be dealing with an error, but they're dealing with two different kinds of error. And so, for example, we were not all that long ago in the book of Galatians, and the problem was Judaizing teachers. But you come into like 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, and particularly 1st John, he's dealing more with Gnosticism. Who's the persecutor of the day? Those written prior to 64 A.D., the main source of persecution was coming from the Jews. Even Paul in Ephesus in A.D. 62 is there because of false accusations made by Jews. But those post-64, 1st and 2nd Peter, 2nd Timothy, the writings of John, that's when the persecution is from the Romans. And so that background information helps us understand those kinds of things. And we talked about the sources to get those from. How do we find the date and the time frame and everything? We can look at commentaries, we can look at workbooks, and a number of sources for that information. But the biggest thing we focused on in that lesson was about context. And I said at the beginning, and again, we have, Lord willing, one more study after this, is the plan on application. But if you take just two things away from this study, it's one, the need that our study should be inductive in nature, at least the majority of our study. There's a time for topical studies, but when we're looking at a text, it should be inductive in nature. And two, the key to understanding of the text is the context. So the context is the verses that surround a text. It may be one or two verses. It may be a whole chapter. It may even be a number of chapters. But that's the context surrounding it. Sometimes we have to talk about the broader context of the whole Bible. When they come to a difficult section of Scripture, I don't know what this means. But I tell you what I do know is all of these possibilities. It can't be this one over here because this would violate another biblical principle. We talked about why context is important. You can take something out of context, and it may not, and you can take it and make it mean whatever you want. We had a series of lessons some time back, probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, on text often taken out of context, and I showed in the depiction at the beginning, there was a preacher who had a coffee cup that says, "I can do all things through a text taken out of context." And so if we take and we can take it out of context and misuse it. The context tells us what it's meant. We talked about how to study it, identifying who's talking, who's being talked to, and a number of other things. And then some examples of how context determines meaning. Some passages that are often misused, but when you put them back in their context, you see what they mean. Our third lesson was over outlining the text. We talked about what an outline is. It's really that organization of our thoughts. We talked about the value of an outline. It helps us sort of get control of things when we're studying. Half your work of interpretation is done with an outline. If you have a true textual outline, which, as we said, point 3, that was our goal, one true to the text, it'll help us explain what the text is saying. And so that's the value of an outline. We talked about how to outline, starting with a rough sketch, looking at other sources to help us, and then we looked at some example outlines in that lesson. Then a couple of weeks ago, before our meeting, we talked about Bible study aids. So we talked about the text, not really an aid. It's necessary. It's the only thing that is absolutely 100% necessary. But the text is where we start. But then we can use sources like a concordance or a dictionary, biblical dictionary, not Merriam-Webster, but a biblical dictionary that defines the words used in the Scriptures. And then we talked about use of commentaries, use of an atlas to help us locate places and where things are taking place, and then a number of electronic resources that can be used. What I want to talk about this evening is focusing more on what we briefly touched on at the beginning of our last lesson on the text, and that is on checking Bible translations. When studying the Bible, when you come to a passage, and even this morning in our Bible class, we pointed out, here's a passage, but what does another translation say? And so, in Ephesians 3, it may use the word dispensation in the New King James, but the New American Standard and English Standard use the word stewardship. And so it can help us in understanding, and we'll talk more about how to use those later on. But let's begin by understanding this. There is differences, the differences of Bible translations. Not all translations are the same. There are some that are very good. There are a number that I believe are good, accurate translations, but there are some that are not as accurate. We'll talk about some of those as we go along this evening. And then we'll come back and talk about how we use those translations. But in order to make sure we're using a good translation as our main text at the beginning, we need to understand a little bit about the difference between them. The first of those is they have varying textual bases. And so there are two main groups of text that are used. There is the Textus Receptus or majority text. Those are slightly different. I think, if memory serves correctly, there's something like 99% the same. There are a few exceptions. We saw one of them this morning in Ephesians 2 in our study. In verse 9, where the word in the Textus Receptus is the word for fellowship, koinonia, versus the word for stewardship that's found earlier in the chapters used in the majority text and the critical text. But for the most part, those are essentially the same. So for simplicity's sake, we group them together. The New King James and the King James, along with the WEB and then the MKJV, the modern King James, are based off the Textus Receptus or majority text. The NKJV and KJV are both Textus Receptus. There are a couple of passages, again, that keep it from being a true majority text, based solely off the majority text, but it's very similar. The majority text holds to this philosophy. We've got a number of these texts between us that they're using. Theirs are a little bit newer than the critical text, but it's based off of numbers. So say we've got 200 texts before us, and 150 of them have the same thing, then that's included. The majority of texts have it. Then we have what is known as the critical text, or sometimes abbreviated NU, the Nestle-Allen United Bible Society. The American Standard, New American Standard, English Standard, the Legacy Standard, which is an update of the 95 New American Standard, the NIV, and the H or the CSB is an update of the HCSB, are all based off of the critical text. The critical text would take age over number. And what I mean by that is, going back to our illustration, say we have 200 texts, and 150 of them have the same thing, but of these 50 over here, most of them are older. Then it says we're going with the older, not the majority. That's a little bit simplistic. There's more to it than than just that and where the texts are found. But for simplicity's sake, that's kind of the just the basics of the differences between the two texts. Now, there are differences, but there are no major differences. And what I mean by that is, if you have a Bible based off the critical text or a Bible based off the majority text or Textus Receptus, what you need to do to be saved, how you need to live, that's all going to be the same. It's a few minor things here or there. Let me illustrate that point. In Philippians chapter 4, and in verse 13, we're familiar with the passage, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's how we often quote it. That is the Textus Receptus and majority text rendering of it. It's the word Christos, the word for Christ. But in the critical text, the New American Standard, English Standard, and others, it'll say, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. The word there is just the word for Him, not the word for Christ. The context would tell us the Him is Christ. But it's a minor difference. Critical text would opt for shorter readings. The latter half of Matthew 19:9 is not there. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. That's not included in the critical text in Matthew 19, though it is included in other passages where that is included in Matthew 5 as well. And so that accounts for some of your differences. But that's not the only thing that accounts for differences. You may have somebody may have a CSB, an LSB, an NASB, and an ESV and an NIV all open before them. And all of them are based off the same text. They're all critical text, and still may find a number of differences between them in a given text. Well, there are really two other things main things that account for that. One of those is varying in translation philosophies. And so there are really four translation philosophies dealt with. Most material will only list three, but the fourth one is a little bit newer, and I'll get to that in a minute. The first of those is what is known as the essential literal or formal equivalence. So Wayne Jackson, in his material, The Bible Translation Controversy, said that the essential literal attempts to translate the words and nuances of the original as literal as possible. So the idea is you're translating the words and the nuances of the language. So here's this word in the Greek. What does it mean in English? We have the word Christos, Christ. So we put it over, or anointed one, but we put it over here as Christ. It's actually a transliteration. Theos, God. Agape, love. They're translating it word for word. This would include translations like the English Standard Version, the New King James, the Legacy Standard, the American Standard, and the New American Standard. The 77 and the 95. The 2020 as well, though I think the update is not quite as good, but that's a bit to get into. But the 95 and 77 in particular focused on this philosophy. We're translating word for word. You then have what is known as the dynamic equivalence or functional equivalence. Again, Wayne Jackson in his material, The Bible Translation Controversy, said the DE, that is dynamic equivalence approach, attempts to convey the meaning of the text in freed and idiomatic English without much regard for the exact wording of the original. And so what this DE approach, this dynamic equivalent approach, is saying is we're not as much focused on translating the words, we're more focused on translating the thought that was in the text. And sometimes in doing that, the Bibles that use this philosophy get a passage right. But doing it this way, it is more of a commentary than a translation at times, and so they are also more likely to miss the point. The most popular of the dynamic equivalent, functional equivalents would be the NIV. By the way, if you go to the preface of your Bible, in the introduction, they'll tell you, here's the approach, of your mainstream translation, they'll tell you, here's the approach we took. So the Legacy Standard, New American Standard, New King James, all these others, here's the approach we took in translating. They'll tell you they use the essential, literal, or formal equivalence. The NIV will tell you it's trying to use dynamic equivalence or functional equivalence. The third of these is the one that I mentioned earlier, is a little bit newer. And what I mean by that is It was sort of an idea that was contrived, I think it was 2005, when the Holman Christian Standard came out, of what they called optimal equivalence. These are out of order here, but optimal equivalence starts with an exhaustive analysis of the text at every level. That is, the word, the phrase, the clause, the sentence, the discourse, in the original language to determine its original meaning and intention or purpose. Then, relying on the latest and best language tools and experts, the nearest corresponding semantic and linguistic equivalents are used to convey as much of that information and intention of the original text with as much clarity and readability as possible. This process assures the maximum transfer of both the words and the thoughts contained in the original. And so basically with the goal, that's the preface of the CSB that lists that one. It was updated in 2017, I believe it was. The HCSB came out in 2005. Basically what they're saying is we're trying to strike a balance. We're not a literal word for word, but we're not more thought for thought. We're kind of trying to get somewhere in the middle. So it's more accurate than the thought for thought translations, but it's not as accurate as, say, the New King James, the English Standard, the New American Standard, that are a word for word translation. And again, the CSB or HCSB would be the best, and to my knowledge, the only example that at least admits to this one in the Scriptures. It was on the previous slide. I'll go back. It was on the previous slide. The other one is a paraphrase. Don't really need a definition to explain that one as well. They try to paraphrase the Scriptures. The Message is one of those. Steer clear of the paraphrases. They're not, there's some value. Occasionally, they might get a point right, but it's very rare, and it's not even as good a commentary as like the NIV would be in using it to see what they had to say. So, what are the differences of Bible translations? Well, they have varying textual basis. It could be majority text or it could be critical text. They have varying translation philosophy. Some are word for word, some are thought for thought, some are trying to sort of be somewhere in between those two. And then finally, sometimes there's a difference because words and phrases can have multiple meanings. Now, I said earlier, you could have an ESV, an LSB, an NASB, an NIV, and a CSB all open before you, and you're going to find some differences. Why is that? Well, they're based off different translation philosophies. But now let's take the NIV and CSB and set them to the side, okay, for just a second. Those are the thought for thought, and then somewhere in the middle ones. Let's go for your word for word: LSB, NASB, and ESV. And I can put them all before me, and they're still going to have different words used between them. They have the same translation philosophy, and they're based off the same text, but they still have differences. Why is that? Well, that's because words or phrases can have multiple meanings. In the English language, words have multiple meanings. For example, the word ball. It could refer to a sphere, or that thing you throw in the yard. It's a ball. It could refer to the game that's to be played. I watched some ball this afternoon. That's the game that was played. The word ball is used to refer to a dance. We may say somebody's on the ball. They're really on top of things. They're on the ball. Or somebody says, have a ball. Have fun. That's the same word. It's the same word, ball, but it can be used to refer to many different things. One more English word to illustrate that. The word bat. The word bat could mean a winged animal. It could be the stick that's used in baseball, or when a hitter comes to the plate, we're saying he's coming up to bat. So there's three different ways the word could be used. The words have multiple meanings. And the way we determine that, by the way, is the context in which that's said. He stepped up to the plate to bat. Well, that doesn't mean he stepped up to the plate with a winged animal. Right? So we let the context of the conversation determine how that English word is used. The same was true in translation. They translate it based off what's being said in the context. So, words and phrases can have multiple meanings. They did so in English. They do so in the Greek. Here's some examples. 2 Timothy 1:12. For this reason I also suffer these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep what I have committed to him until that day. That's the New King James. The English Standard Version says, whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard until that day what has been entrusted to me. We say, well, what's the difference there in the Greek? There is none. Both textual bases have the same Greek words. In fact, the New American Standard says something along the lines of the New King James. But the word that occurs there could mean that which was entrusted from Paul to God, or that which was entrusted from God to Paul. It could mean either one. And there's a sense in which they're both, there's truth to both of those. And that's a time for a study of 2 Timothy 1. But the point is, either one of those could be true. How do they know how to translate it? Well, they look at the context and say, here's what he seems to be saying based off of the context. Here's one more, John 3:36. He who believes in the Son, I'm reading the New King James, he who believes in the Son has everlasting life, and he who does not believe the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. ESV now. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. The word could mean to believe, or it could mean to obey. Now we know those two have to go hand in hand. One that truly believes will obey it. If you obey, it means one truly believes. But it could mean either one. It doesn't really affect our understanding of the text. We understand you have to believe and obey. But the point is that these words could have multiple meanings in that text. So a Greek word may have 2 or 3 different words it could be translated by. And so sometimes there's differences just because words have multiple meanings. So, well, that's a lot of information there on a short time frame on the differences of Bible translations, but I want us to get a basic understanding of the differences before we get into talking about how we check translations. Because the first thing we need to do is understand about using our main text versus using a comparative text. So our main text, that's the text we use for regular study. This will be your preferred translation. I preach from the New King James. And so most of my time study is done in the New King James, and then I'll use others to compare. We'll come to how we do that in a minute. But this is my main text of study, and so I look at it and then use it for study, and then we'll go to other translations to compare. Now, when choosing your main text, you need to choose one. It needs to be one of a sound translation philosophy. So again, there are 4 philosophies, but just 3 we want to consider for choosing a translation. Essential literal or formal equivalence, that is word for word. Dynamic equivalence, that is thought for thought, or what they call the optimal equivalence. That's somewhere in the middle. The one we want to choose is we need to be looking for one and choosing one that is one of the essential literal or the formal equivalence, that word-for-word translation. That would include the New King James Version, the King James Version, the English Standard Version, the American Standard Version. That one's out of print, so unless you're using electronically, that would be nearly impossible to get a hold of. The New American Standard, or the Legacy Standard, which again is an update of the New American Standard. All 6 of those are word-for-word translations. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have faults. Every translation has faults. There is no such thing as a perfect translation. Right? They were translated by men. But you need to choose one that is of that sound translation philosophy, because you want one that when you're reading it, you can trust. Here are people that were at least striving to try to be true to the original as much as possible. And each of those 6 has those. Again, I could think of some problems with some of them. Well, really, there's some problems with all of them. I can think of some more than others, but we want to choose one from that list. This list here is it's a little bit older list, but this side here is your literal translation. These are your more free, and then these are the paraphrases over here. So the Message and the Living Bible, they're paraphrases. Phillips Modern English is a paraphrase. Jerusalem Bible was paraphrased. And basically this bottom right here is sort of your standard deviation. Is it low to the literal? So like it's more literal. The shorter the line, the more literal it is. That's just the simple way to understand this. So the most accurate, probably the most accurate there ever was, is the American Standard. It even strived to keep the original order of the Greek. So it's very literal. They have the King James next, then the New King James, and the NASB of 1977. Then the NASBU, that would be the 95 update. The ESV, the New American Bible, the Revised Standard Version, the Modern Language Bible, Those aren't as mainstream, so we haven't dealt with those. And then the Holman Christian Standard is on the list right here. This one right here in the middle of the circle there is the Holman Christian Standard. The Christian Standard would be about the same. It was mostly the same. And then the NIV is somewhere well on down, more down the list here, sort of in the middle of all of it. So I bring up this chart to say what we want to choose one is one near the top of that list. That is a more literal translation. So the 5 of the 6 I mentioned are listed there, with the exception of the LSB because it was released in 2020, and this chart is pre-2017 because it was still the Holman Christian Standard back then. So your main text of study should be one of those. My recommendation, if you recall, I did up until probably about not even 2 months ago, I had been preaching from the ESV for the last couple of years. One reason I went back to the New King James is because it shows me the textual differences in the footnotes, the NU says, and all of that. And so it helps show you those differences, which is one reason I like it. But any of those 6 would be a good main text. But then, outside of our main text, we then have a comparative text. And that is, it may be one or even more translations you use to compare to your main text to enhance your understanding. So, you may be reading a difficult passage, and I'll come to some examples later on where it explains it better. So, I'm not going to get into any of those right now. We'll come to that at the end. But you may read a passage and say, I'm a little confused by what this is saying. And then I look at another translation. Oh, that makes more sense. It can make things clearer to understand. You can use one, in this case, as a comparative text, one free in translation philosophy. And what I mean by that is, don't go all the way to the paraphrases, but if you want to use an NIV, a CSB, or one of the others somewhere in the middle of that chart, in this example, they may not be the best main text, but they can be some good commentaries. They may be wrong sometimes in other passages, but sometimes they render a passage better than your main text might render it, even though it may be a more sound translation philosophy. Sometimes they may not translate it better, but they may explain it in a commentary sense. It talks about it in Philippians chapter 2, that Christ did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. And I think it's the NIV that says he did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, or something along those lines. And so it may not be the most accurate translation, but that helps explain exactly what it means, that he didn't consider something to be grasped. That helps explain the text, so it can be good use. Now, let me say this. Using one for comparison does not mean you endorse all it says. I think sometimes we may be concerned, well, if I'm talking about this, but it's not a good philosophy, I don't want to sound like I'm endorsing it. Just because we quote from it or we look at it doesn't mean we endorse it. There are times you come to a passage and you're reading a commentator and say, this commentator summarized this passage really well. I've done it before. I've read a commentator before and said, I think he summarized this passage well. But that same commentator, I don't agree with on what they say on divorce and remarriage. I believe they teach error on divorce and remarriage. But that he may have summarized this passage over here very well. Doesn't mean I endorse everything he teaches. I just think he summarized this passage really well. And so, same thing in use of translations. You may quote from a translation. That doesn't mean you endorse everything it says. But it means you think it summarized that passage well. Let's talk for just a moment about how to check translations. How is it that we do this? I think there are 3 main ways in which we check translations. One, we check a specific verse in another translation. This is probably the way we will do it most often. This is what I would do most often when I know there may be a difference or think there may be a difference or a passage is difficult. We're reading a passage and maybe we're confused by that specific verse's meaning. And then maybe I look around at the context and I'm trying to apply all those other principles we've talked about, and then I'm still confused. But then I may pick up another translation. Maybe I'm reading from the New King James, and I'm still a little confused with what it's saying, but I pick up an ESV, and that passage translates it in a way that makes it more clear. And again, I'll come to some examples of that here in a minute. And then I can say, okay, that helped explain it. So that's what we'll do sometimes is we're reading a passage in our preferred translation, our main text, and then we look at another translation for it to help explain to us what that verse means. And maybe they translated it in a way that's clear. The second way is we can check that original word, how that original word in the Greek or Hebrew, mostly the Greek is where we use it, how that word is translated in our translation. Let me give an illustration of that. In Acts chapter 11 and in verse 26, the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. What does that mean? They were called Christians. Well, let me look at the use of the word called. In Romans chapter 7 and in verse 3, it says she shall be called, that if somebody's married if a woman's married to another man while her husband still lives, she shall be called an adulteress. In Acts 10 and in verse 22 and in Hebrews 8:5, it's translated divinely instructed. In Matthew 2:12 and Hebrews 11:7, it says they were divinely warned. And then in Luke 2:26, that word is translated revealed. As I begin to study the word, what I understand is the way this word called is used is it has to do with being called or stated by God. So when I come to Acts 11:26, they were first called Christians at Antioch. It wasn't Paul, or then Saul. It wasn't Barnabas that called them that. It wasn't some term used by those around them. It was something they were called by God. Now I understand what it means. When I come to Romans 7:3, she shall be called an adulteress. That's not Paul's opinion on it. That's not the people at Rome's opinion on it. It's God that's calling her the adulteress. That, looking at how that word is used, has helped explain to me that it has to do with, it means being called by God. God's the one doing the calling. So they're first called Christians at Antioch. It was God that called them Christians. So see, sometimes I can take a word, and I may not go look at a number of translations, but I can look at how that word is used in my translation, that specific Greek word. Now, this can be easily done, more so now than before. The easier way to do that is with Bible programs like we talked about last time. Some of the programs I use, I can take and I can right-click on the word and hit Word Study, and here's every time it occurs in the Scriptures. And there's every time I can see how it's translated. But even with using Bible programs, Vines does it. You look up that original word, you find the word that's used, and it'll talk about the times that it's used. Or Strong's will do it. You find out what that original word is. Maybe you look at a text that's tagged with Strong's. And then you look at that Strong's number, and here's the number, the ways it's translated throughout the Scriptures. Well, then it can help me understand how it's easily done. The Strong's is tied to the King James, though electronically they're tied more often to whatever translation you're in. But you can check your translation for how it's translated, just like all those examples on the word called, and it can help explain what is being said. The third way, excuse me, that we can check translations is by doing our reading from multiple translations. There's a bit of a challenge. We're coming up on Ephesians 4 in our Bible study, where hopefully on Wednesday evening we'll be able to get started with it. We've got just a few verses left in Romans 3. And the challenge is, we get to Romans 4, read it multiple times. Hopefully that's what we do in our preparation. We read Romans 4, or Ephesians 4, we read Ephesians 4, we read Ephesians 4 as we're getting ready for it. But as you read Ephesians 4, maybe you use the New King James like I do. You read Ephesians 4, and then maybe one of those times you reread it, you read it out of the English Standard Version, or you read it out of the New American Standard Version, or some other translation. Maybe you even read it out of one of those we said is a little bit more free in its translation philosophy. And you can read it out of another translation and see how it compares. I said before, sometimes I compare just verse to verse. Sometimes what I do too is reading through is I'll split screen them on a text. If you use a Bible program, you can do that easily, where you put two texts side by side and you can read verse 1 here and then see how it's translated in the other translation. And so you can do your reading from multiple translations as well. So we're talking about checking translations. It begins by us understanding there's a difference of translations. Not all translations are equal in terms of how good they are and how accurate they are, because they're based off different philosophy. There's different textual bases as to why they vary, but then the big one is there's different translation philosophies. And that's the one where we need to be careful. We're talking about using our main text versus comparative text. Our main text is what we study from the most. Our comparative is what we use to sort of supplement and look at to explain. And we talked about how to check translations. Let's talk about some examples, particularly of that first one. We looked at an example already of looking at that word in our text. But let's talk about some examples where looking at another translation will help us in our understanding. The first of those is Romans 6 and in verse 16. The first one on the board is the King James Version. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are, to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. New King James Version. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slaves whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death, or of obedience leading to righteousness? I believe I copied the wrong verse there. I believe it's verse 17 that I'm wanting. Go to Romans 6 with me. It's Romans 6:17. Look at Romans 6:17 with me. The New King James I'll read from first. That's what I have before me. But God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. The King James Version in Romans chapter 6 and in verse 17 would instead say, but thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from that heart to that standard of teaching to which you were committed. The American Standard would say something along the same lines, or that's the English Standard. The King James Version would say that doctrine which was delivered you. So that is, the doctrine was taught to you, that was delivered to you. Verses in the New King James, he's saying it's the doctrine to which you were delivered. You were committed over to that doctrine, that teaching, and thus you obeyed. So when I read the King James, it sounds like he's saying the doctrine was delivered to you and you obeyed it. But what he's saying, you're obeying that to which you were delivered. And so it helps me understand the passage. 1 Thessalonians 5:22. This was referenced the other day during our meeting in one of the lessons. King James Version, abstain from all appearance of evil. And so sometimes we say, okay, well, this appears evil, so we need to steer clear of that. Now, there's a sense in which that's true. But that's not what it means in the original. It doesn't mean from the appearance of evil. It means abstain from every kind of evil. Abstain from every kind of way in which evil can appear. The NIV reject every kind of evil. And so the appearance of evil, though that is true in a sense, that's not what the original is saying. So when I read the King James, abstain from all appearances of evil versus abstain from every form. Now the New King James and the NIV have helped me understand more what that's saying. Abstain from anything and everything that is evil. Here's one, Romans 14:1. This is a controversial text. Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things. This is a text often used to argue that we can fellowship those who are in sin or fellowship those who teach false doctrine. And so the whole of Romans 14 is used to argue from that. But the key to understanding the chapter is verse 1. And the New King James says not to dispute over doubtful things. Well, what does that mean? The American Standard says, yet not for a decision of scruples. Scruples is probably not a word you've used much in the last few weeks in your language, but here's a word we'll understand. The Legacy Standard. Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on opinions. Well, now that becomes just a little bit clearer. So what's the doubtful things or the scruples? Well, it's one's opinions. And as you go through Romans 14, you see that unfold. One believes you can eat meat and the other does not. One wants to observe a day and the other does not. And there are things that are indifferent to God. It's one's opinion. And so don't receive him to quarrel over his opinions. Well, now I'm beginning to understand a little more as I look at more translation what it means. Here's one more example. Acts 17:11. It is said that those that were in Thessalonica were more noble, or those in Berea were more noble than those in Thessalonica in the King James. The New King James Version says they're more fair-minded. The NIV says they're of more noble character. ESV, like the King James, says more noble. Legacy Standard, more noble-minded. Now, I'll come to the NLT in a second, but let's stop there for a second. The word there literally means noble. The most literal translation is just, they're more noble. But it has to do with their character and their mind, their mindset there. And so, while more noble may be most literal, fair-minded helps me get a little bit of an understanding as to what's being said. Those at Thessalonica heard the message and rejected it. They didn't give it a fair hearing. Those at Berea were willing to sit down and listen and give it a fair hearing. They're fair-minded. So because of that, we could describe them as having a more noble character. The LSB and the New American Standard as well tries to strike a balance between the two. They're more noble-minded. It was their mind that was more noble. Now the NLT, while it may not be the most accurate translation of this text, I think gives the best commentary on the text and explanation, and that is the idea of them being more noble-minded is they were more open-minded. They were more willing to listen than those at Thessalonica. And so what I hope you're seeing here is as we look at a text, I may see more noble and think, well, what does it have to do with anything? Because the word noble has to do typically with one's birth and their position. But as I begin to look at it, how it's translated in other translations, it begins to help me understand it's not noble in terms of birth, it's noble in terms of their mindset. And they're more open-minded. This one's not on the board, but I want to give you one more. I think helps illustrate that. Go to 1 Peter 1. This is one that is an idiomatic expression. We use idioms in our language all the time. It's raining cats and dogs. We don't literally mean it's raining dogs and cats outside, that you're going to walk outside and see them falling from the sky. We just use that in an idiomatic expression to say it's raining heavy. Well, in 1 Peter 1 and in verse 13, the Apostle Peter said, "Therefore gird up the loins of your mind. Be sober and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Now, gird up the loins of your mind is an idiomatic expression. We don't use that language today. It had to do with they would often wear long flowing robes in that day and time, and if you were going to get ready to go somewhere, you had to tie it up. You had to gird your waist. We see that in the Old Testament when they were told, when the Passover was instituted, to gird up their waist so they could be ready to run. But we don't use that language today. If you look at the English Standard, it may not be as accurate in terms of word for word, but it translates that idiomatic expression into what it means. Prepare your minds for action. You can think about it like our expression. Roll up your sleeves and get to work. That gird up the loins of your mind is kind of parallel along with that. It's the idea of getting ready. And so I may read gird up the loins of your mind, and I don't know what in the world girding up your loins has to do with anything, because we don't talk like that. But when I read it in the English Standard or the New American Standard, where they don't have it in the idiomatic expression, but in the meaning of the idiomatic expression, then it allows me to understand its meaning. And so that's why the use of translations is very helpful in our Bible study, because mine may not make it that one passage clear as another, and this other translation may help me. Like the NLT may tell me that this word in Acts 17 means they're open-minded and not have to do with their birth and being noble. So that's about checking Bible translations. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Lord willing, we'll finish next week, and we'll talk about making application. And that is, after we spend our time in study, we've looked at the text, we've looked at the context, we've outlined the text, we've used all of these aids that we need to use to help study, we've checked other translations. Now that I've looked at what it means in the text, how do I make application of that? And that's what we'll talk about, Lord willing, next week. But it may be as we come to a close this evening that there's one or more present who may have never responded in obedience to the gospel. If you're here and you've heard the word of God and you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, will not repent of your sins, confess your faith in Him, be buried in the waters of baptism, rising to walk in the newness of life, having your sins forgiven. Maybe you're here and you've done that, and you say, somewhere along the line I've not been as faithful as I need to be. If it's a sin of a private nature, you can take it to the Lord privately in prayer. But if it's a sin of a public nature, you would desire the prayers of the congregation. We'll gladly pray with you for God to forgive. No matter what your need is, if we can assist you this evening in any way, would you not come forward right now, together we stand and as we sing.